8:46 a.m. I was cleaning out the garage when I heard loud knocking at the door, accompanied by the static buzz of a walkie-talkie outside. Through the window crack, I saw a group of people in uniforms that looked somewhat like police officers. Shirts with embroidered badges, utility belts dangling with radios. But there were no official insignias. I stepped outside, just in time to hear them shout, "You are in violation of community regulations. Your vehicle is being impounded immediately." Right there, on the driveway of my own legally owned property, my personal SUV was being hooked up to a tow truck, about to be taken away for the alleged crime of violating the neighborhood's aesthetic parking standards. The only problem is, I am the sheriff of this county, and I know the law better than anyone here. If you're watching this video, don't look away. What you're about to witness will make you rethink everything about so-called community authority and the terrifying truth behind those who pretend to enforce the law just because they wear uniforms and carry radios. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to follow this intense story, because everything from here is just getting started. When I signed the paper to buy the house in Willow Grove, I thought, finally, I've found some peace. A small town where everyone knows each other's name, where the sound of lawnmowers blends with the smell of baked apple pie every Sunday afternoon. After 20 years of facing all kinds of trouble in the field, that was all I needed: a piece of land, a front porch, and a little bit of peace. But just 3 days after moving in, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. And it all began with the patrols. They weren't police, but they dressed like they were playing cops in some low-budget stage play. Navy uniforms with unfamiliar logos, shoulder straps, and baseball caps. They even carried walkie-talkies and wore name tags, like they were filming CSI Suburban Edition. At first, I thought it was just some sort of neighborhood watch program, a voluntary neighborhood watch kind of deal. I didn't pay much attention until Saturday morning when I found a $250 citation taped to the windshield of my SUV for parking in my own driveway. I picked up the ticket. Slanted text. A red stamp from no identifiable legal authority. Reason for the violation: parking inconsistent with community aesthetic standards, HOA Code 57B. I looked toward the neighbor's yard, just in time to catch 2 people in uniform, walking away, their radios crackling on their shoulders. I called out. They stopped, turned around. One of them, bald with the build of a former mall cop, raised a hand in a mock military salute and said, "Good morning, sir. We are the residential response team under the HOA. The citation has been issued. You may file a written response within 48 hours. I kept calm, not because I wasn't angry, but because I'd seen this before, just not in a neighborhood, but in the places I used to investigate, where nobodies put on made-up uniforms, convinced others they had authority, and started enforcing their own rules. I pulled out my wallet, took out a small badge, and flipped it open under the sharp morning light. Ethan McBride, County Sheriff. I spoke slowly. What law are you enforcing? And who authorized you to issue a $250 citation in a private residential area? No answer. Just shifty eyes, trembling hands, and a thick, heavy silence. I knew that it looked well. It's the moment someone realizes the game they were playing has just turned into a real investigation. I knew it wouldn't stop at the $250 citation. People who believe in self-appointed authority rarely stop after a single sloppily printed piece of paper. The problem was, they didn't know whose territory they had just stepped into. That morning, I was tidying up the garage when I heard the roar of a diesel engine coming from the top of the street. A dusty yellow tow truck was slowly backing into my driveway, its steel wheels grinding against the freshly poured concrete. Behind it were 3 HOA officers, the familiar lineup again, Navy uniforms, shoulder radios, eyes locked on my Jeep Cherokee as if it were evidence in a felony case. I stood there, cleaning cloth still in hand. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, voice calm but firm. The bald one, apparently the commander, waved a piece of paper at me like it was a badge of legitimacy. "You failed to pay the citation. We are authorized to impound mobile violations under Section 4, Clause 7 of the Resident Conduct Code." "I think you're overstepping," I replied, my tone steady, as if I were asking for more sugar in my coffee. "You'd better call the police and let them handle this." The tow truck driver let out a smug chuckle. "Police? Around here, we are the law." I sighed. Not from exhaustion, just because I knew the story was about to turn a page. I stepped forward, pulled a shining metal badge from my coat pocket, and held it up right in front of them. "Ethan McBride, County Sheriff." The atmosphere shifted instantly, one silent heartbeat. The way they glanced at each other was no different than students caught cheating in an exam room. The bald man swallowed hard, gripping his clipboard until his knuckles turned white, stammering as if grasping for a lifeline. "We're just enforcing community regulations. This is a legally recognized HOA. Every resident agrees to the terms." I looked him straight in the eyes, letting the silence speak for me for a few seconds before replying. "First," I said slowly, "I never signed any contract with this HOA. Second, even in legally binding HOAs, seizing personal property requires a court order, not a photocopied piece of paper." I took another step forward, eyes locked on the group now slowly backing away. "Your use of misleading uniforms, issuance of legally invalid citations, and the attempt to tow my vehicle without a court-approved warrant qualifies as organized theft." No one said a word after that. Only the tow truck's engine huffed into the silence, and the air grew heavy, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath to see what would happen next. No one spoke. The tow truck driver quietly climbed back into the cab and drove away. One of the HOA officers quickly removed his name tag and shoved it into his pocket without hesitation. Another started frantically tapping on his phone, likely calling a higher-up. I just stood there silently, letting them feel the full weight of the truth. Their little cosplay cop act had officially come to an end. That very day, I received an invitation to a community meeting from the HOA Executive Board. A card printed on heavy stock paper, like a wedding invitation, properly signed by Karen Farthington, the HOA president. The reason for the meeting? To address behavior disrupting the order of the neighborhood. The community meeting was held at the old clubhouse, once the venue for BBQs and Halloween parties before everything went sideways. Inside, nearly 30 residents filled the chairs, many of them my neighbors, people who still believed the HOA was a legally empowered organization. I arrived on time, carrying nothing but the badge in my pocket and a small recorder hidden in my coat. Karen Mitchell stood at the podium, wearing her self-styled HOA president uniform, a white, waist-cincher suit with a chest medal that, upon closer look, was just a fake badge from an online university. Her blonde hair curled like she was about to shoot a hair dye commercial. Her eyes swept across the crowded room, pausing on me for a beat longer than necessary, like a hawk spotting prey. Based on the community bylaws, and due to behavior that publicly challenged the authority of the neighborhood administration, we are exercising our right to perform a citizen's arrest on Ethan McBride. I almost laughed out loud, but simply stood still, hands in pockets. 2 men in HOA uniforms stepped out from the side rows. One of them was the familiar bald guy, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, which I later learned were plastic, painted to look like steel, but at a glance were enough to incite panic. I waited until they were just a few steps away. Then I pulled the sheriff badge from my pocket, held it up under the ceiling light, letting the cold metallic gleam slice through the room like a slap to every naive belief in the place. Ethan McBride, County Sheriff, I said clearly, my voice steady like a knife through the silence that had seized the room. Karen tried to stay composed, but I saw her pale. We're simply enforcing community authority. I shook my head. No, you're not. You're impersonating a public official, abusing power, and you could be prosecuted for unlawful detainment. Then, from inside my coat, I pulled out the small recorder and pressed play. Karen's voice echoed, crisp and damning. We have to make residents believe we're the police. If they think we hold real power, they'll obey without question. Someone dropped the plastic cuffs. The clatter on the floor sounded like a gunshot. The other man froze mid-step, face drained of all color. I let the silence linger for a few beats, giving the room time to process the collapse of their illusion. Then, from inside my coat, I pulled out the small recorder again and pressed play. The grainy speaker buzzed through the hall and Karen's voice filled the air. We have to make residents believe we're the police. If they think we hold real power, they'll obey without question. The entire room held its breath. I didn't need to look. I could feel the wide-eyed stares, the murmurs rising, the heads turning like ripples in a courtroom storm. Then came the voice of a man on the recording, likely the bald guy. If anyone pushes back, hit them hard. No mercy. Power only matters when they're afraid. When the recording ended, a middle-aged woman in the front row stood up, her voice trembling with anger. This is fraud. This isn't about protecting the community. This is abuse. A young mother holding a child burst out. I've paid over $1,200 in fines in the past 3 months just for leaving a bike on the porch. Another person stood up, then another. The outcry spread through the hall like a wildfire in the wind. Those who once stayed silent out of fear now erupted, as if freed from a long nightmare. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, watching Karen Farthington, queen of a counterfeit kingdom, teeter like a sandcastle beneath a real storm. And I knew this was only the beginning. I stood still in the stormy room, my eyes locked on Karen Farthington. She clung to the podium as if holding it tightly could somehow pull reality back into her hands. Slowly, I pulled a search warrant from my jacket pocket and held it high for everyone to see. The red seal of the county court stood out starkly under the hall's cold, sterile lights. I reported this entire case to the district attorney's office 3 days ago, I said, my voice calm, but cutting through Karen's crumbling facade like a knife. And under the order signed by Judge Harrington, from this moment on, this HOA board is officially under investigation for criminal offenses. As I finished speaking, 3 real deputies, in full county uniforms, badges gleaming, stepped through the hall doors. They said nothing. They moved with quiet precision. The first one walked straight to the bald guy, twisted his arm behind his back, and cuffed him before he could react. Another calmly removed name tags, walkie-talkies, internal documents, and even the HOA board's laptop from the table. Everything was sealed, cataloged, and placed into evidence bags. The entire room held its breath. A resident, Mr. Carlson, who lived on the corner, suddenly stood up, hands trembling as he held a stack of bills. I was fined $8,000, he said, voice thick with emotion. Just because the fence in my backyard was 2 inches too tall. I was too afraid to speak up because they threatened to sue me. I nodded toward the officers. One of them walked over, took the papers, and marked them for evidence. Police began searching the small HOA office next to the hall. The door swung open, revealing layers of secrets like an onion being peeled. An internal fine chart, with inflated fees 2 or 3 times higher than official regulations. Audio recordings threatening residents, unmistakably in Karen's voice and those of her self-appointed officers. forged documents bearing fake government seals, a confidential Excel file listing residents to be strongly suppressed and others from whom more fines could be extracted. As every piece of evidence surfaced under the harsh white lights and in full view of the community, Karen Farthington knew her performance was over. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, this time with real steel, not the phony plastic handcuffs her crew once flaunted. I stepped closer as Officer Davis clearly read out the charges: organized fraud, impersonating law enforcement, embezzlement of community funds, and unlawful coercion of residents. The remaining HOA officers were cuffed one by one and led out, stunned by the gaze of the entire neighborhood. No one clapped. No one cheered. They simply stood, turning their eyes toward Karen in silent, unified contempt. She was no longer the figure of authority, just a con artist in a shiny blazer, forced to bow before the light of justice. The trial of Karen Farthington and her associates took place in a small federal court, but the atmosphere inside was so heavy it was hard to breathe. I sat in the witness chair, looking at Karen and her so-called community managers, the ones who once self-proclaimed themselves as the authority, now facing punishment. I had spent considerable time and effort exposing this fraudulent system. But now, finally, the truth had been laid bare, and justice had prevailed. The courtroom was filled with curious onlookers, but as I stood and began presenting the evidence, the room fell into complete silence. The audio recordings, the forged financial documents, the unsigned contracts from residents. Everything I brought forward was as clear as daylight. Karen's and her associates' handwritten notes, detailing the ridiculous fines they imposed, were now undeniable pieces of evidence. With each piece of evidence, I saw the last glimmers of hope in Karen, and her crew's eyes slowly fade away. The verdict was handed down shortly thereafter. HOA President Karen Farthington was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for charges of impersonating law enforcement, financial fraud, embezzling community funds, coercing, and threatening residents. Her two loyal assistants, the bald guy and the young secretary, each received 10 years in prison for their active participation in the illegal activities. The court also ruled to fully dissolve the Willow Grove HOA organization. All regulations and fines previously imposed under the HOA's name were declared invalid. Residents were now free to file separate lawsuits to seek compensation if they wished. After the verdict was announced, I didn't return to my office right away. I spent a few moments in the quiet, reflecting on everything that had happened and the profound changes that had come to this neighborhood. But I didn't let the silence last too long. I stood before the residents and declared, "From now on, this will be your self-governed community council. You will elect representatives to help maintain order in your community. But I make this promise. We will no longer have unreasonable fines, only respect and cooperation." Smiles began to appear on everyone's faces. They were no longer pawns in the HOA's power game. Now, they were the true owners of their homes and community. The dissolution meeting was held right at the former power headquarters of the HOA. I stood silently in the crowd, observing from a distance. No more, "No parking over 2 hours" signs. No more meaningless regulations about grass height, brick color, or mailbox style. Only the sound of children's laughter echoed across the wide lawn. The little girls and boys, holding colorful chalks, drew bright pictures on the walkway, no longer fearing someone would shout at them or fine them. The adults, who had once been oppressed by these absurd rules, could now stand tall without fear whenever they stepped outside. The entire neighborhood seemed to wake up, no longer hearing arguments or threats. All that could be heard were joyful, hopeful laughs. They were beginning to understand that true self-governance wasn't a distant dream. It was a right they truly deserved. That afternoon, as the sun set behind the peaceful rooftops, we set up an outdoor feast. Pastries, lemonade, and cold beer were passed around. Mr. Carlson, who once trembled at the thought of a fence that exceeded regulations by 2 inches, was now sitting and laughing beside the BBQ pit.